the social model of disability. When we talk about models of disability, what we're talking about is different ways of understanding it. So we're not talking about a grand theory explaining everything to do with disability from a medical or a scientific point of view. Instead, we're talking about a framework for how we view disability within society. There are different ways, different models for understanding disability. Many of them, too many to consider here. But the two main ones that we want to consider are the medical model and the social model. The trade union movement and the disabled people's movement support and use the social model. So what is the medical model? The medical model of disability sees the impairment as the cause of disabled people's disadvantage. So disabled people need to be treated, cared for, cured, pitied, or segregated. And although some of the more unpleasant expressions of this model have been removed, if you like, by a couple of decades of enlightenment and campaigning, it does still dominate political and legal decision making. In the 1970s, there was a new radical self-organised disabled people's movement, and it prioritised the demand for the right to live independently. And it soon realised that in order to achieve that demand, to win the argument for that, it would have to challenge the whole way that society looked at disability. So it labelled the established way of looking at disability the medical model, and it drew up a new way of looking at disability, which became known as the social model. The crucial difference is that the social model distinguishes between impairment and disability. Impairment is the trait or shortfall in functioning. Disability is the difficulty caused to people with impairments by barriers that society puts in their way. So the social model, as well as being, in my view, more progressive, is also more practical because it says identify these barriers and then we can remove them. Barriers can be physical. Barriers can be sensory. They can be communication barriers. They could be attitude barriers. A barrier could be an obstruction being present, or it could be a facility not being present. Indeed, the barrier is anything that excludes or hampers participation by disabled people. So, what's the difference between these two models? First of all, just for clarification, it isn't the case that the social model sees no role for the medical profession in the lives of disabled people. When we say we prefer the social model to the medical model, that doesn't mean we're against medical intervention. It's about the way that society sees disability. So let's take the example of this hypothetical person here. A medical model description might say this: this person is blind. Her disability is blindness. She cannot read a book. The social model alternative way of looking at this would be: this person is blind. Her impairment is blindness. Her disability is the fact that her local library only stocks print books. If the library stocked braille and or audio books, that would reduce the disability. So why does this matter? And why particularly does it matter in the workplace? Imagine you have a meeting between an employer and, say, a dyslexic worker. Under the medical model, a manager might say to the dyslexic worker, tell me how your dyslexia causes you problems at work. Okay, quite a reasonable question, sounds like, doesn't it? He's trying to be helpful, presuming it's a he. But let's look at a social model alternative. Under the social model, better question. Tell me how work causes problems to you as a dyslexic worker. Now have a think about the difference between the two and how they would actually pan out in the meeting. Under the first option, the worker has to sit there and slag himself off. He has to say, well, my dyslexia makes me really slow at reading. It means my spelling's terrible. etc., which is not only demoralising for that worker, it also doesn't help us identify any solutions, because the employer is not going to stop the worker being dyslexic, and neither is anybody else. In the second scenario, with the social model way of posing the question, tell me how work causes problems to you as a dyslexic worker, the worker can then say things like, well, you know that employee bulletin that you put out every week in Times New Roman, 9-point? That's really hard for me to read. And you know you only give me the documents for the meeting 10 minutes before it starts? That doesn't give me enough time to read it before the meeting. And not only is that better for the morale of the worker because they're not slagging themselves off anymore, but it also is much more effective at identifying solutions. The employer could then say, okay, I'll start doing those employee bulletins in 12-point Arial. Or the employer can say, okay, I'll make sure the paperwork for each meeting is out 2 hours before it rather than 10 minutes before it. And there's another advantage in the second version of this as well, isn't there? Because if the employer does that, then they're not only improving the workplace for this one individual dyslexic worker, they're improving it for all dyslexic workers, including the ones who haven't come forward, who may not even know they're dyslexic, or are dyslexic workers of the future who don't even work there yet. So, the medical model tends to be accompanied by various attitudes. So I'm going to look at some of those attitudes now and suggest social model alternatives to them. The medical model tends to assume that disabled people need and want to be cured, whereas the social model would emphasise needing and wanting to be accepted. Now, whether you need or want to be cured will, of course, depend on the nature of the impairment or condition. A medical model approach would tend to assume that disabled people need decisions made about them by experts, whereas the social model would emphasise that they can make their own decisions with the support, expertise, if necessary. A medical model approach would assume that disabled people can make little or no contribution at work, whereas a social model approach would argue that disabled people can make a major contribution in an accessible job. A medical model approach might see disabled people as dangerous to themselves and to others, whereas a social model approach would stress that the environment can be dangerous to disabled people. A medical model approach sees something wrong with the disabled person. A social model approach sees something wrong with the society that excludes them. So to look back at the example I gave before about the blind woman wanting to read a book, a medical model approach would say there's something wrong with the blind woman. A social model approach would say that there's something wrong with the library. A medical model approach tends to emphasise what people can't do. Can't walk, can't spell, can't hear, etc. Whereas a social model approach would stress what people can do if barriers are removed. Medical model approach sees the impairment as the problem. Social model approach sees prejudice and barriers as the main problems. A medical model approach views disabled people as not really like normal people, whereas a social model approach would stress that it is just as normal to be disabled as to be non-disabled, and may contest the use of the word normal at all. A medical model approach may well assume that a disabled person needs constant care, whereas a social model approach would stress that we need rights, access, independence, and may need some care. So finally, to sum up, the key difference between the medical and the social model is where they see the problem of disability. For the medical model, disability is an individual problem where disabled people need to be fixed. For the social model, disability is a collective social issue where barriers need to be removed.